This is Bart Peterson, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Greg Gilchrist, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
This is Dan DeMarco, and you are listening to the FCPA Compliance Report on the Compliance Podcast Network.
The FCPA Compliance Report is the longest-running podcast in compliance, engaging a wide variety of compliance-related guests and topics. Each week, Tom Fox brings you the top commentators and information which will inform your compliance program going forward. Join us again for the top podcast in compliance, hosted by the voice of compliance, Tom Fox. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode, and I have Kevin Abikoff and Aline Osorio. And today we're going to talk about a topic that probably does not get the play that it should in the United States, but it is a topic of high interest right now in Brazil. So both Kevin and Aline, thank you so much for visiting with me today.
It's our pleasure, and I'm honored to be joined today by my friend and colleague Aline, who's a constitutional law professor in Brazil and a former Supreme Court clerk. So we have very good authority with us today, Tom.
So we're going to take up the general topic of monies that are generated from anti-corruption settlements, both in the United States and Brazil, and where does that money go? This podcast was triggered by an excellent article that Kevin and Aline co-authored entitled Corruption Settlements, Coronavirus, and the Road Paved with Good Intentions. I'm going to focus on that last part, the road paved with good intentions, and really ask you both what led you to write this article?
Really glad you asked, and thanks again for having us today. You know, we started off, you know, we all know the road to hell is the one paved with good intentions. And when we saw what was going on in Brazil, and we'll talk about that in a moment, it reminded me of the great debate in the U.S. around what happens with settlement proceeds. And as we saw Brazil doing this particular kind of allocation, it really caused us to focus back on the age-old question and then to put it in a new light with the way Brazil was handling it.
So recently, at the request of the Brazilian Prosecutor General, the Supreme Court redirected the unspent portion of the Petrobras anti-corruption settlement to be used in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil. And we noted a recent trend in Brazilian anti-corruption settlements toward directing at least part of the proceeds to specific actions or causes. And because Brazilian law does not provide for the allocation of penalties deriving from anti-corruption settlements, prosecutors appear to have now a certain leeway to earmark these funds. As we will discuss, the Petrobras settlement is a very stark example of the flexibility that is currently due into the Brazilian process, and of the discussions of potential problems it may raise.
Aline, it might be interesting if you could walk us through the history of the Petrobras settlement in terms of where the funds were going to go, what was initially proposed, and how it got to benefiting education and environment, at least initially.
Sure. It's a longer story. So what happened is that the Petrobras settlement with the U.S. authorities directed 80% of the penalties to Brazilian authorities. And this to be defined by an agreement with the Brazilian prosecutors. What happened was that the Brazilian prosecution office entered into an agreement with Petrobras under which 50% of the penalty would be allocated to broad public interest initiatives and the other 50% to compensate shareholders. And in a very unusual arrangement, the agreement provided that such amounts would go to special funds managed by a foundation to be established by the Federal Prosecution Office. And the prosecutors would then oversee the allocation of funds. But the Supreme Court suspended the agreement at the request of the Prosecutor General on the grounds that it violated the separation of powers. The Prosecutor General, the Speakers of the House and the Senate, and the Attorney General reached an agreement under which the funds would be directed for education and environment protection. But why education and environment? When the negotiations were taking place, the Amazon forest was burning, and this received a lot of attention from the media. And the Prosecutor General considered that the urgency of the environment situation justified the allocation of the funds. And I think that with regards to education, the Prosecutor General just argued that directing money to education would serve the broad public interest, allowing the country to reduce social economic disparity.
So how did, or rather, what led to the change, or at least the request to the Brazilian Supreme Court to perhaps change or redirect those funds, Aline?
In the same way that the decision to allocate funds to the environment is a function of current events, the state of sanitary emergency prompted the Prosecutor General to petition the Supreme Court to reallocate the unspent portion of the settlement funds to the fight against the pandemic. And it's interesting to see that other judges followed suit. There are already similar decisions in Rio de Janeiro, and I wouldn't be surprised if this become a model followed in other significant settlements, including ones that are being worked on right now. And I can say there are already negotiations regarding JDS.
So if I could maybe turn now to some policy discussions. I have some fairly strong thoughts on this, but Kevin and Aline, where do you guys shake out on who should decide where the proceeds from fines and penalties in anti-corruption settlements go?
Yeah. So, I mean, it scares me a little, Tom, that you've already staked out some ground but haven't said what it is. So hate to disagree with my host, but I'll take a chance anyway. It's a long time ago, some smart guy said, the democracy, sloppy as it is the worst system of government except for any other. And I guess I continue to hold to that. When we look at the $2+ billion that's already been allocated in connection with the coronavirus crisis here in the U.S., it went through, the legislative, bicameral legislative and executive processes, moved pretty quickly. There was some cork in it, as always is the case in the U.S. Politics certainly reared its ugly head during the process, before and after. But I continue to believe, at least, that having elected representatives and an elected president making decisions about the allocation of public resources is probably in the long-term best interest of a civil society and a democracy, because people have an opportunity to cast their vote to decide that those people aren't doing a very good job. But that may be what's right for the U.S., not necessarily what's right everywhere. And Aline will comment on Brazil in a second, but it's exactly in circumstances like this where there is nothing but good intentions, and allocating funds to something like coronavirus and trying to alleviate the horrible suffering caused by the pandemic. It's exactly in those circumstances where everything is obvious that you have to look a little deeper and worry that the next time maybe it won't be so obvious. And if you put the hands in a singular person or even a couple of people who are not elected, the decisions they make may not be in the overall best interests of the public, and it might not be anything they could do about it. But, Aline can give you a perspective from Brazil, if you will.
Please do so.
Sure. I think that I think that my first comment is that I agree that individual decision making and kind of taking the decision on the allocation of the budget out of the political democratic process have several dangers. So why do we think prosecutors and judges have legitimacy to make such policy decisions? But maybe in Brazil, there are kind of elements that in light of recent events that cause people to have less trust in the political process. In any case, because of the democratic difficulty involved, at least Brazil should formalize the process and have kind of a clear legal basis for such allocative decisions. It cannot continue to do it informally as it is now. It is true that no one would argue against directing funds to the fight against COVID, but people may question other types of allocations. For example, if the funds are directed to unions or NGOs. So at the end, I think maybe in Brazil, what we sometimes miss is this basic trust in the political process that the U.S. has.
So I'm going to perhaps take it in a little bit different direction, because I feel like the safest way is to pay the funds into the general registry of the country and let the political process determine how those funds are distributed. And I say that because I don't want to incentivize prosecutors any more than they're already incentivized to try to go after targets that either may be easy targets, maybe politically or reputationally expedient targets, or maybe targets with a lot of money. I guess my experience is somewhat tempered or informed, I should say, by the big tobacco litigation here in the United States, where state attorney generals really fought for the states and got allocated monies. And then I saw the states allocate those monies. And then the next question is, well, who can we go after next? And there's been a series of large corporate clients that state attorney generals have basically gone after and gotten lots of money from. Sometimes it goes into the general funds of the state. Sometimes it's allocated for specific purposes. I would just like to see it go into a general fund. In 2009, the Congress, when it was debating the original formulation of Dodd-Frank, had not a whistleblower, but had SEC monies. SEC would be funded directly from its fines and penalties collected under white-collar crime and prosecution under Dodd-Frank going forward. And I was vehemently against that, because I don't want the SEC incented or incentivized to go after people to basically on a contingent fee to get more funding. We see that at the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom. So if it goes into the general fund of a country, as it does with FCPA settlements here, at least we have the control mechanism or oversight, Kevin, that you articulated, of having a democratic government who's put a budget in place that's overseen by our elected officials. If they want to allocate those monies any way they can, once it goes into the general funds, that's the democratic process. To me, is as messy as that may be. But I just find that allocating specific funds to any, allowing the prosecutors to allocate monies is a road that I'm just not comfortable with going forward.
Well, and Tom, if I could echo that, you also have seen in the U.S. an awful lot of attorney generals, some in very large, important states, who have gone on to try and parlay their significant victories into higher office, be it governor or otherwise. And that certainly brings out the bonfire of the vanities, if you will, that you're alluding to a little bit as well. And SFO and the UK aside, you see unfortunate examples of countries like Nigeria where they'll actually allocate prosecution to third parties with unfortunate results.
Aline, if I could ask, It appears, though, that as much discomfort I may have, or at least unease, it appears that in Brazil, the system works, and the system works perhaps for cultural reasons, perhaps for other reasons. But what is your assessment of how this system works for Brazil?
So my personal assessment is that it does not work correctly, for the reasons you just mentioned. And I think that during the COVID pandemic, we'll have more and more settlements like the Petrobras one. And probably you're right, the instances are not always the correct ones. But in Brazil, what happened is that this is very, let's say, new. So So to understand the context, in Brazil, the development of the transactions and cooperative anti-corruption agreement is much more recent. It was expanded in 2013 when the Organized Crime Act was enacted and gained much more popularity and use in the context of our huge car wash operation. But I think we are still experimenting, and this is a policy discussion that Brazil will have to have soon. And I think Congress is already discussing this in the context of COVID, and we'll probably have some developments very soon.
And I would add, and I guess I speak under Aline's control here, who's the real expert on Brazil. But I think part of what troubles us the most when we look at Brazil is not the end result, because who could argue with it, but rather the process and the fact that this really emerged from an entirely unwritten, ad hoc, informal process. And just because you get to the right result once doesn't mean that it doesn't lead to trouble down the road where the right result is less obvious. And that's you marry the impairment to the democratic process with a very informal, ad hoc process that almost seems to be written as it was going along, and it really leaves you in an uncomfortable place from a democratic standpoint, notwithstanding the result.
I guess I should say at this point, ditto, ditto.
Excellent.
Well, guys, I wanted to thank you both for raising this issue because, as I said, I don't think we really, if we do think about this in America, we don't talk about it enough, Kevin. And obviously, Aline, this is something on the forefront of practitioners such as yourselves, lawyers in Brazil's mind. So this has been a really good visit of a very important policy issue, and I hope we can continue this discussion.
We'll look forward to it, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I hope you will join me for next week's episode where I take up another topic of FCPA or compliance related. The FCPA Compliance Report is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again next week.